Recently, there's been a lot of talk about housing affordability and whether or not supply is the answer. We know this is a complex issue, not the least because of the three different levels of government in this country, each with some but not all of the responsibility for housing policy. So how does housing policy get formulated? Which level of government holds the most swing? And what is the long-term plan for a city like Sydney, and who or what is driving it?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, and author of Auction Ready.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say on here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of a professional.
Don't forget that you can access the transcript for this episode on the website, as well as download our free full or forecaster report, Which Experts Can You Trust to Get It Right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
Today's guest is going to help us understand how changes in policy and macro and micro trends impact the way people move, work, and most importantly, find homes to live in. Chris O'Dell is the Director of Analytics at, is it GYDE or GYDE?
GYDE Consulting.
GYDE Consulting in New South Wales. His career has spanned planning, engineering and transport in both the public and private sectors. And while working at the New South Wales state government or in the government, he was responsible for the creation of key data sets monitoring housing activity and population growth. Chris now works very closely with all levels of government, strategic planners, industry, and anyone else who will listen about the importance of evidence-based decision-making. Sounds thrilling. We're very curious to understand how the system works and looking forward to this chat. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure, Veronica and Chris. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Great to be here, Chris, and thanks for coming on. I mean, I have to say thanks to Veronica. That is the first time in over 200 episodes she's nailed everything the first time.
Cheeky.
So you were on form today. So, Chris, I'm going to start with the first one. Big question. I mean, government decision-making, how often, especially around housing, how often is it evidence-based in your opinion?
Look, I think we're trying really hard to make it evidence-based as much as we possibly can, but unfortunately, and I don't think anyone would disagree on me with this, you kind of see the evidence sort of get distilled and sort of, watered down a little bit as it goes up the tree to that final sort of decision-making where we might not get exactly what we want. But you know what? We chip away at this sort of stuff, and I know that government chips away at it. I know that poor old public servants who have brilliant policy ideas will see those policy ideas get watered down over time. But you know, working in both the private and public sector, I have no doubt that there is that desire to keep on chipping away at these things.
Yeah, I mean, today we're going to talk predominantly around New South Wales and Sydney, but I mean, it's sort of similar issues no matter what state you talk about. But just, I guess, a different version of it. The Greater Sydney Plan, I think, is quite interesting for anyone to read. I mean, what's your thoughts on the whole idea behind that?
Well, I think the idea of having an overarching Sydney plan is an absolutely critical one, which makes a lot of sense. And I think, the government's just announced the Greater Cities Commission, where they've picked up now that Sydney model that they've had for the last 5 or 6 years, and now they've said, well, let's apply that across the Illawarra, the Hunter, and Sydney. So clearly they've got a desire to kind of take that model and expand it to those sort of, urban areas outside of Sydney, which I think is a fabulous idea and makes a lot of sense. But as always with these things, you've got to see how they're implemented before you can say whether it's working or not.
So what are the key features of that?
Of what? Sorry, Veronica. As
in the Greater Sydney Plan, and how that then sort of rolls out or translates into larger regional centres.
Well, I think if you have a look at the Sydney Plan as a whole, what you're trying to do is just see that 20-year vision. Like what are we wanting? What are we aiming for in terms of that high-level vision for a city? In theory, what that means then is that you take those strategic directions from the top and you apply those down into the local level, and then your local government should pick those up and then make local government decisions that are, basically hooked on those higher level strategic visions. So I think what you'd like to see in the region is that in those other regional areas is that we do actually have regional plans at the moment for the Illawarra, for the Hunter. But I think when you start pulling them together with Sydney as well. You're hopefully going to get a more integrated vision for the metropolises that we have in New South Wales, especially sort of Sydney and around the, those, a couple of 100 k's either side of Sydney, north and south. Yeah. So hopefully it's a more integrated vision. But again, we have to wait a bit of time to see what that looks like. I know the Sydney plans at the moment are in review. So the Greater Sydney Commission plans that we've had for the last 5 years, they're up for a redo now. I think they're starting them now, and I think they're going to be published mid next year, late next year. Don't hold me to those dates, but it's soon. It's within 12 to 18 months. I think we're going to see a new version of them, which is probably really good timing considering the incredible change in the way that we're moving around New South Wales and functioning in cities, primarily because of COVID. So it's probably a great time to refresh those plans and have a big look and see what is the future that we want for our cities.
I mean, that's right, because the rule book sort of got rewritten, right? I mean, I think 100%. Prior to COVID, we had clients that were pressure cooker time was the most important thing to get back to the family and the kids. And, when you're going to the city 5 days a week, that matters a lot. But, COVID shifted everything and clients started saying, hang on a sec, I love the Central Coast. I love the north of Wollongong. I wouldn't mind moving up to the mountains, etc.
Yeah.
And it makes sense from a geography point of view, but also a distant point of view, with train links, etc. So,
we all know everyone that's made the change, right? Like, I could rattle off half a dozen people that are, good friends of mine where I've called them and said, "What are you doing?" And they're like, "Oh, we're in Blaxland now." It's like, "Oh, when did that happen?" It's happening a lot. But the other thing that I think gets neglected in this story about people moving from Sydney is we've actually seen a lot of people who would have normally left a regional town, normally left Newcastle, who normally left Wollongong, they've actually stayed.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe even a bigger driver than the people coming from Sydney. It's the people who decided to not move, who would have historically gone. And I think there's a huge opportunity there for regional towns and regional centres to say, well, maybe that was a temporary hold on an idea to move to a bigger city, to move to Sydney, to move to Brisbane, to move to Melbourne. How do we as a regional town keep those people now that they've made that decision to delay what was an inevitable move because of jobs, schooling, whatever, housing, whatever those opportunities are, they've stayed. So I think that's what I would be doing if I was doing these regional plans, is looking at it and saying, well, what are the things that have kept people here in that short term that would have normally left, and how do we keep doing those things to keep them in the regional towns? Because the people that move are the mobile people. They're the working age population. They're the people that contribute to a town. That work the jobs, they have the kids at school, all the good things you want in a really nice town, a nice regional area. And they're the ones that didn't move. So, I'd be trying my best to hold on to them.
It's all the brain drain, isn't it? It's like the issue with, a lot of Kiwis, they, get their education, get trained up at uni, and they, cross the water. People in Adelaide, Perth, they jump on a plane and move to the East Coast, etc. But if they're sticking around, then the city's actually got talent sticking around, starting businesses and growing the city. Same as population, I guess. Even though we haven't got much migration, it doesn't mean our population isn't increasing, right? We're still having kids. We're still
having kids. I think I had a look at the New South Wales population growth last financial year, and it grew by about 25,000 people without a migrant, which is natural increase.
Well, that's also with some migration to Queensland.
That's right. Yeah. So that's still that pattern of people heading north out of New South Wales. And I thought, well, what's 25,000? Because I love doing things like the classic. How many swimming pools is that? Right. Whenever you do the and that's about the size of Goulburn, right? So we added a town of Goulburn to New South Wales last year. Without any effort, really, other than having a few babies and a few internal migrants moving around. So even at that, the lowest it can possibly be, we're still adding quite a few people into the state. So, once migrants come back, we're going to see that number go up quite significantly, I think.
We've got, I think, some interesting changes, and many times we've said this, and many times our guests have said this, that COVID has fast-tracked 10 years worth of change, right? And this is across many disciplines. I was talking to Kirsten Craze this morning. She's a property journalist. We've interviewed her a couple of times, and on the last few months anyway, we interviewed her around sea changing. She grew up sort of in the mid North Coast, New South Wales, and has returned there with her, young family. And we were just talking about the real pressure on rentals in that area in particular. So I know that's micro, but the reality is there's a major housing shortage occurring in regional areas, and it's building because, of course, there's more people move there and taking, bigger earning jobs with them and all the rest of it. The pressure, it's effectively these regional towns are undergoing gentrification. The sort of things that, Redfern and Waterloo in Sydney has undergone, because as land values go up, then people start moving in that wouldn't previously have lived there and pricing out the people who could live there because it was cheap. So this is happening regionally as well. So in terms of the big picture, in terms of big time strategy, how much, I guess, is looked at that as being a recent phenomena that may or may not be permanent, and then how do you plan for that?
It's one of those things, right? So be careful what you wish for, right? Because you've kind of got – but I think the thing about regional, you're absolutely right, is they didn't have that ability to adapt to these changes that happen basically overnight.
Yeah.
But the thing that gets me about it is if you actually have a look at, say, if you have a look at rental data, because I think that's a really important sort of canary in the coal mine data set that tells you something's going on quickly, as opposed to some of the other stuff that you've got to wait a year or two for the data to come through to tell you what's going on. The rental stuff is live and it really shows you what's happening. But if you take Hunter, for example, or if you take the mid-north coast, any of those eastern parts of New South Wales, you'll see that the rental vacancy rates were dropping 4, 5, 6 years ago.
Wow,
they were already on the way down. So Hunter's a great example of that, they were in sort of that rental stress sort of world where we say, what is it about, if your vacancy rates across the board are under 3%, then you're probably not in a balanced market. 3% is your balanced market, right? Like that's where you've probably got the supply and the demand sort of at a good point. I think the Hunter was in 2014, it was already below 3%, and it's been heading down since. I'm doing a bit of work at the moment up in the north coast, sort of around, Richmond Valley, Lismore, Tweed, that part of the world. And again, those vacancy rates were already heading down. I just don't think I don't think people were paying attention to that. I think there was clearly noise about it, but it was noise about things that were influencing it, like short-term rental accommodation. We're having big issues with rentals because of Airbnb. Yes, absolutely. Like that is another layer on top of all the other problems that we've had. Yeah. But we were already in that we were going to get there at some point. I think COVID, like you said, sped it up. But the problems were there to be seen if someone actually paid attention to them already. We were heading the wrong way.
So we already had like an undersupply of building, I guess, or underdevelopment, for the growing population of the city, underinvestment from investors in these areas because there wasn't enough rental. And then you had a huge influx of demand and very little supply, right? A lot of people not selling, a lot of, people selling. Yeah. But you're saying...
And in your regional town, when you have on average 20, 30 rental properties, in your small market, like it doesn't take much for that to just be completely obliterated, right? And that's what's played out a lot in a lot of the sort of those desirable regional towns. But I guess the argument that the thing that I'll keep saying to people is that this was coming. This shouldn't have been a surprise. How quickly it happened may be a surprise, but it was coming. And if you have a look at all those lead indicators about a housing market, you could see it coming.
One of the fallacies that we often fall for is that we look for the one cause, the one reason. And I know it jumped to my mind, short-term rentals, you said it. And you did mention a few other things as well. So trying not to fall into that fallacy, you're saying that this was happening. What were the causes? And I would imagine there's some unique causes to every individual area, right? But I guess in a bit of a broad brushstroke, what's been driving that problem. And I'll sort of preface, well, before you answer, just in that conversation today with Kirsten, she was saying that, like there'd be people living in rental accommodation for years, with maybe a $5 a week rise. Then all of a sudden it sort of goes to $50, $100 a week rises and pricing out effectively a whole community. So that in itself is quite sudden. And so those, there was this sort of, you're saying this was happening, and yet it appeared to be no impact beforehand, or was there an impact? And it just wasn't enough that it was, anyone was taking notice. Like,
I think you're right. I think the impact was, because the impact was localized, it kind of got lost. And we're never going to read an article about the in a national city newspaper about a short-term issue with rentals in a small town of Mudgee, who has got some serious issues with housing supply. But how's that little story going to get into a national conversation? I just don't think it is, right? But what happened with COVID was that played out all at the same time across many, many different little parts of the state, which all of a sudden, when you compound all that together, you got a story where people went, oh wow, this is pretty impactful. This is actually having a big impact on people. And I think maybe that was the story the story was there, but it just got amplified because it was so quick, really, compared to what it was doing. But in terms of what caused it, you're right. Like every part of the state's got its own unique problems. But if you have a look, like I use an example in the Hunter Valley. The Hunter Valley is, like, I think it's one of the areas of New South Wales that Greater Newcastle and sort of up the Hunter Expressway. There's an enormous opportunity in that part of the world. It's absolutely, if we put a lot of effort into that, we could see that become a legitimate city in itself, not just a satellite part of Sydney, but an actual, a real regional city that I don't think this country's really got yet. You could argue maybe the Gold Coast. Gold Coast is a good example of a regional city, but I'm talking, in New South Wales, we've got that opportunity there. I don't think that the decision makers, I don't think that there's policy that actually, maybe even policy says it, but people aren't viewing it like a metropolis, like a city. They're still planning for it in small little towns. We're a small town. We're a small region. It's like, well, actually, you're kind of on the edge there. So you've got to have that big idea and think big to take these opportunities that are in front of you.
Which gets back to where I was going to take that next question, is that how does that then feed back into policymakers? And then because we've got that, local, state, and then federal government levels, how does any of that make a difference? How does it become big picture?
Look, I think you've got to. There's a great example that I often, if anyone asks me about the Hunter and tells me what's one of the problems with the Hunter, it's there's a huge. I'm using Hunter as an example because it's just one of the areas that I spend a lot of time in, but it's a really good sort of example of stuff that's playing out across the state. There's parts of the Hunter that, they can't build the greenfield housing supply quick enough out there. There's an enormous amount of demand. The demand's been there for 10 years. If you're going into that market and you want to build a couple of houses or a multi-unit development or something in that greenfield area, sort of up along the Hunter Expressway, there's really blunt instruments from a policy point of view that try and get in the way of actual development. Like you've got to demonstrate that there's under a 15-year supply in your area before we'll entertain the idea of more supply. Now in our market like Hunter, it's happening so fast that you build it, they'll come kind of thing. So there's policy levers there that are just, I think, too blunt. They're not responsive enough to when the timing's right. You've got to pull that lever and you've got to let people move in, right? And so I think we're struggling from a policy point of view with that ability just to be agile in a very changing world.
Well, I mean, right now that's what you need is you need supply, right? To fix rental markets, you need more investors and you need more places for rent. And at the moment, you've got a lot of home buyers moving in there. So a lot of home buyers are buying off investors that are cashing in. So that's making it even harder for investors. But if you want to increase, improve housing affordability in the Hunter and, stop all these Sydney-siders buying the Hunters' homes, you know what I mean? Then you've got to give them an option, right? And they might be the greenfield estates. But what you're saying is they're not being responsive enough to the post-COVID world. They're sort of basing it on the old fundamentals of, we're going to grow slow as a regional city. Let's just make sure we don't upset the current owners and all those sort of things.
I think there's a bit of that. I think there's just a little bit of and I guess the other thing is that you have a look at the way that the city of Newcastle's positioning itself, and they want to be open for business, and they're, and so you listen to them, and it's fabulous to hear that. But are we seeing that reflective in every decision on the ground? Probably not all of the decisions. Some of them, yes, but some on the ground, you think, oh guys, come on, like let's. These are some great opportunities here. Let's go with it.
Do you think they're keeping Newcastle? I grew up in Newcastle. I was up there for Easter, and they've got a tram in there, but it's a lot of the joke around the city is that, or a town, is that no one gets on it, right? It's sort of too big picture. They could have just put in a bus and save themselves all that investment. So do you think there's a bit of that as well? Like we sort of, you said build it and they'll come, but, when I look at that, I sort of feel like maybe it's not ready for a tram yet. It's still a small town.
Yeah, look, I don't know. Like I can think of the same thing, the same argument for the train stations out in southwest Sydney around Leppington and that line there. But when that line opened up, it was a ghost town. But if you go out there now, it's getting pretty busy, and it'll be pretty. It's going to be significant. So I think. I don't know. I kind of like the idea of getting the transport in early, locking that away, and then building around it, as opposed to retrofitting. Because retrofitting, we've all seen how retrofitting works in some public transport solutions, and it's often not as perfect as we would like it to be if we could go back and start again. So I see what I do. Yeah, the tram is an interesting one. I've caught it quite a few times, and it isn't that busy yet. But if they build around it, you might, it's supposed to activate that area. I don't know. There's a lot. It's one of those conversations you don't want to have at an event at Newcastle, because you don't know which side of the fence someone's on, and they're always on one side or the other. There's never that balanced view, right? It's either the worst thing that's ever happened or the best thing. Yeah.
The one thing that in that particular tram line that really amazes me is they didn't take it to the beach.
Yeah, it would have been
because then people might have got on it.
Yeah. It's close, but it's not to NIMBYs or, the other beaches.
Yeah.
You have a bit of a walk to Newcastle Beach, etc. I mean, what's your thoughts, Chris, on long-term forecasting and population, right? Like, a lot of the time it's undercooked. We don't expect the country to be that desirable, and we probably underestimate population growth. But then we maybe, overestimate the ability to build, enough housing. What's your sort of thoughts on the longer-term projections? Like, are they pretty bang on in your belief, or, do you reckon we'll just over or under build? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think from a population point of view, if you have a look at the projections, I mean, the only real projections that you can kind of rely on now are probably the stuff that was in the budget recently from the federal government, because they've had to think about what forward population looks like from a migration point of view. State governments have yet to publish, or New South Wales state government's yet to publish its update on what the projections look like going forward, sort of post-COVID, and they're due soon. So I'd like to see what they do, because I think they're going to have to really adjust those levers a little bit, because clearly migration is one of the biggest drivers of growth, especially in Sydney. So it'll be really interesting to see where they land in terms of that number, but I can't see the migration numbers not getting back to where they were pretty quickly. There's a huge. I mean, everyone I know is calling out for workers. The education sector's got to get back up and running as quickly as possible. A lot of that migration is key workers that we're desperate for, and there's a budget position clearly from the federal government who desperately wants more migrants over here to pop the taxes up. So, it's pretty important that we get them back from a number of levels. But I can't see it not coming back pretty strongly. I guess where they settle is a very interesting problem that maybe we can't crystal ball too much, because they're going to settle where the new housing is, right, or where their housing opportunities are, and we don't really know what that is, or housing and job opportunities. Sorry, it's always the two things that you need to settle is somewhere to work and somewhere to live, and so I'm not sure what those migrant patterns are going to be post-COVID, because they'll, traditionally, they'll all, migrants will come and land in Sydney. They might spend a couple of months in Sydney, and then they might either settle or they'll disperse. And where they dispersed was relatively predictable. And the numbers that they dispersed at was relatively predictable, but I think you'd be mad to try and pick what that is in the next round of the next 5 to 10 years. I wouldn't, I could have my guesses at it, but God, it'd be a guess and nothing else.
But that sort of leads into a major challenge with policy then, doesn't it? Because then you've got to, it's not as quickly go, okay, build a building and then all of a sudden it's there. I mean, it takes years to go through the planning process.
That's right.
And developers have got to take a punt on this as well. Someone's actually got to take the gamble. And like you look at the inner city apartment situation in Sydney and also Melbourne and Brisbane, there's an oversupply. So we're talking about housing shortage. We've got an oversupply of stock in 3 of our biggest cities, right where the migrants are more likely to spend at least a short period of time, as you've said there. But then rolling out from that, how if you fan out, there's so many different options about what you could be doing, and you're talking about building, designing metropolises. Is that the plural of metropolis? Metropoli, and then you've got to assume that the metropolis that you're planning actually takes off, because there's been this hub idea in Sydney, around Liverpool and Paramatta, and was there another one? This idea of this knowledge centre, but there's been talk of it. There's been a certain amount of investment, but has it really been a success?
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in sort of I grew up in the Blue Mountains, but Paramatta for me was always that kind of big town that we used to, that spent a bit of time in as a teenager and a younger kid. But I don't know. I feel like Paramatta's finally taking the shape that everyone said it was going to. It's just taken a lot longer than what was planned. It's got that city vibe about it now. I mean, it was delayed by COVID, but if you go back there now and wander around, it really does have that kind of bigger vibe that everyone was always planning for. So I think Paramatta's worked or working or on the way to, but it takes time. But I absolutely agree with you. I'm not sure what's going to happen out in sort of the Western Airport area where, the government wants to essentially build our third city. Yeah. I really don't know. I'm always a little bit skeptical, not so much of the fact that that's a great idea to build something out there. My skepticism is the timing of it and how long it's actually going to take versus what the ambition is. So it's a bit of a challenge, because I just think the biggest challenge that I can see is in that part of the world is, how do you take a cohort of, say, our most mobile people, 18 to 35-year-olds. How do you take that cohort who want to live in an inner city environment? How do you pick them up and put them out in the Western Sydney Airport? Now that I think the challenge, there's a huge challenge here, achievable over time, but it's not going to happen overnight. And so those timelines, I think, should be probably a bit longer. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be investing in that sort of stuff, but it also doesn't mean that we should be neglecting the inner city parts of Sydney as well, because they also need that effort, that investment, and that thinking as well.
I mean, everyone got wrapped up in the Paramatta story, for example, a few years ago. So much development going on there, but apartments there, for example, have done nothing for 5-6 years. A lot of people, a lot of commercial can get knocked down for high rise, and if you fell for the big picture Paramatta and you went and bought an apartment, then right now you'd probably be sitting underwater, right? And you made no money when the Sydney markets, for example, gone up 30-40%. And so sometimes people fall for the idea, not for the actual the time it takes. Maybe Paramatta will get there one day, but it doesn't mean you should buy there today. When there's potentially a big supply coming.
Yeah, well, I think the Paramatta, I think you're right. There was the huge supply of Paramatta over the last 3 or 4 years, just massive, and then migrants disappeared. And so you kind of lost a big chunk of what the potential market could have been there. So, but I do think over time that'll fill itself up. It just has to, because we are going to see an increase in people coming into the city.
Yeah.
It's whether or not they choose Paramatta over somewhere else, because there's a bit more choice now. There's a bit more competition.
Yeah,
like it might not be Paramatta. It might be
Brisbane.
It might be Brisbane. It might be Wollongong. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, I think there's, given that we've proven over the last couple of years that you don't have to live in the city to actually function, work in a city type job. You've opened that door up to a bit more competition from the regional towns, which I think is a healthy thing. Overall, it's got to be a good thing, because we want people to have choice, not just to be in the city.
I mean, we've got lots of talk, obviously, around building pressures, timber, steel, labour, etc., and building costs. I mean, what's your sort of take on all of that and how it's sort of going to play out?
Well, from my point of view, this is really just getting feedback from our clients about how hard it is.
Yeah.
And they're just saying to us that everything is a challenge at the moment. Getting labour and materials are the two biggest problems that we've got at the moment in terms of turning. If we really were serious about getting our supply back up, it's getting the materials and the people to build the things. That is a real challenge. I mean, I was like a lot of people during lockdown. I did a bit of a renovation on my house, and my builder told me that I got the last beam on the boat, and if I didn't get that beam that was going to hold our kitchen up, it would have been a 6-month wait. It was, I think that's just how that supply chain. You talk to anyone who's building at the moment, and that is a real problem for them.
Yeah, I've got a client who's basically provides stuff to Bunnings and big hardware companies, etc. Yep. And when I was doing my reno as well, he was on the phone to me. He says, "Chris, what are you doing with your timber?" I said, "What do you mean? I'll just go to the shop and get it. When we need it." He goes, "Get it now." He said, "We can." Yeah. And this was like, when was it? It was like late 2020 sort of time, and and then obviously it all hit in 2021, right? And like it was, but you could see these things sort of building, and builders must be just very scared at the moment, because how do you price a development? How do you have the confidence you're going to be able to build it? Do you want to take that risk on when margins are so tight? And so all builders, you can see other builders going under, ProBuild, Condo, etc. So like, why would you, want to take on that risk at the moment? So one, it's maybe they could build, but why would a developer want to take it on when it's so unknown what the costs are going to be?
Yeah, look, I agree. And I think it may even get harder for your regional parts of the world, because, they're used to a certain tier of developer, right? It's usually pretty, it's not big scale, big jobs. If they want to step up into a higher tier and start delivering, some more medium density type developments, there's that expertise in managing regional development, which is I'm not a developer, but I can only imagine managing a regional development of, 2 to 3 story medium density development in a town on the fringe of a town is a very different proposition in a regional town as it is in a city, in terms of access to labour, the logistics of the whole thing. And if you're not embedded in that part of the world, it is a challenge, right? And it can only be hard, and trying to encourage people to pick themselves up and do that type of development, I think, is going to be challenging.
If you like what you're hearing here, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars, please. Every review helps make it easier for other people to find us and hear what our amazing guests have to say. We love hearing your questions, and we're planning more listener Q&A episodes. Please send your questions in. You can send them via the website, which is theelephantintheroom.com.au, or directly via email to questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au.
And the bar's been lifted too, because we've got the Commissioner for Building in New South Wales, David Chandler, who we've had on the podcast, and he's pretty, bullish and making some changes and really raising the bar in terms of the standard of residential apartment buildings. Is that having an impact, do you think, on a willingness of developers to develop? Or are they sitting back waiting to see how that unfolds?
I think, first of all, it's the work that David Chandler's doing is absolutely critical because we need confidence in the system.
100%.
And we just have to do it. And, it's just, I've been to a few of his presentations. I've seen his slideshow. I've watched a couple of his videos where he goes and bombs and look at that hole, I love it. It's fantastic. But I think there is going to be a bit of a short-term lull because those developers that shouldn't be in the system that we have relied on over the last few years to build certain things, which clearly needed a lot of fixing. Those developers are spooked, and so they should be, and they're going to move out of the market. And there's a delivery that we're going to rely on those developers to deliver a certain proportion of supply that we need. That means I think that there is going to be a bit of a short-term sort of pause on those until more reputable people come in and develop those things that we actually want, the better quality ones. But we kind of relied a little bit on the poor quality for a while there. Not a great thing for people that are buying these places. But so I do definitely think you're going to get a little bit of a drop down, but in the long run, it's a better outcome for us. It's just a timing problem because we don't we can't really afford another drop on the drop that we're having at the moment in terms of getting that supply up. But it's absolutely needed that we don't get those crappy developments, built into the cities. So, I think it's going to have an impact for sure.
You mentioned greenfield estates are getting snapped up. And, where it's first home buyers moving to regions or where it's, city buyers moving to the fringes, etc. There seems to be, there's always land banking, which we've just spoke about on a podcast, and I guess the conflict of interest there for developers to release it slowly so they can keep prices and make profits, etc., rather than flooding a market, etc. What's your sort of thoughts around speaking to all your clients and developers? Is getting site acquisition really quite tough because of the land banking that does go on, and that certain families and wealth pools managing certain pockets and not developing because they know if they don't develop, then it keeps supply? Do you find that the site acquisitions a real problem for people who do want to build, rather than, because people are just sitting on their hands, or do you not think that's the case?
I look again like you guys, and it's not the world that that I experience a lot, but I hear the stories, and you always hear the stories of land banking. You got to take it with a grain of salt sometimes in terms of, who's telling me the story of land banking is the first question, right? But the fact is it's totally a phenomenon out on the fringes, absolutely. And I think when anyone sees land values going through the roof, prices going through the roof, their instinct is to always hold on to that land to see if they can get a better price, right? I don't think you need to be too much of an expert to understand that that's clearly what some people are doing. I think the bigger issue that we have in the greenfield areas is getting that infrastructure there ready, so that when the time is right to build that greenfield, the actual enabling infrastructure, the water, the roads, that's delivered on time at the same time that we're ready to build. Because I think at the moment, especially in places like the southwest of Sydney, there's a lot of plans out there to deliver that infrastructure, but is it actually happening where we need it? I don't know exactly what the answer to that question is, but I hear that more from people, that it's the enabling infrastructure is the biggest issue. And I think if we've had a run on greenfield in Sydney, especially, like the amount of greenfield development and the completions in greenfield's been through the roof over the last couple of years. That's basically saved Sydney's housing supply from an enormous drop. Without that greenfield supply, we'd be incredibly low. So we're going to run out of that greenfield land quicker than we anticipated. It sort of goes back to that point I was making earlier about agility and sort of responding to it. If we thought we had 20 years worth of supply and we've gobbled up so much in 2 years, we've got to fast track that next round, or we're going to inevitably run out of land that's appropriate both from someone who's willing to sell, but also appropriate in terms of its infrastructure and it's set up ready to go.
So the answer, if you run out of land, though, is to go up, right?
Oh, I think that's definitely one of the answers, yeah. But, up in the right places.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
Yeah. So, up around your transport investment. So we spoke about Leppington earlier. What's the density around those parts of the world? Probably it's pretty low. Are we making the most of that? Are we making the most of our northwest corridor in Sydney, where we've got the metro running every 4 minutes?
Yeah.
It's patchy. There is some higher density, medium density developments, but most of it is detached housing. So I guess the question is, are we making the most of those transport corridors where we'd like to see the density go up?
So let's say they do that. Greenfields, that's a bit of a given, I guess. Over the next 20, 30, 40 years, we're just going to keep on turning farmland to 400 square metre block of land with a cheap
400.
house.
That's a
400.
huge
I was going to say, what are you? which greenfield are you going for?
Maybe Newcastle.
Old days.
You know what I'm talking about though. These blocks of land. You probably count the street or the nature strip in that 400 as well. But I mean, obviously that's going to happen. I think it makes sense then to do high density around train stations, especially this metro, right? Just because it's such a big investment from the state government, you'd want to, pay back all the local council. Yeah. But once you're through that, I mean, the next thing is sort of, the middle and outer ring, flooding it with townhouses and duplexes, etc. Do you think that's what we can rely on that happening a long time in a long time in the future till that really happens on scale? And then even till the next level where you start cutting up the NIMBYs, I guess. Do you think that the NIMBYs are pretty safe for some time? Because there's going to be no pressure on them to rezone these lands because they could say, well, the opportunity's still in greenfield. The opportunity's still in high density around train stations. Like there's so much opportunity to build before we're even going to look at these more sort of lifestyle leafy areas.
Jeez, it's I don't know. It's one of those things where I think the answer to that question is it's got to be everything. And I mean, you were talking on your podcast the other week. You guys were talking about the kind of everyone in that Felinsky report. They kind of put people into different categories. You're either a supply person or you're not. And it just frustrates. It really frustrates me that you can't have a nuanced conversation about this, because I think there are incredible opportunities in our leafy areas in the right places to really get the density up. Absolutely. And if you're in a leafy area that just happens to be near a transport corridor, or where the government has just put a hell of a lot of investment in a new train station, in a new, even an upgrade to the highway or whatever that investment is, I feel like as a NIMBY, you've got to actually start thinking about, well, I've got to share that investment with everyone else, and that means the density's got to go up. And I know that's the other thing, right? It's always, the argument is always, I'm all for density as long as it doesn't happen near me. But I think it can't be an argument about one or the other. It's got to be everything is up for negotiation. And if I'm in a good spot that's got good access and it's the right place to do something in terms of going up, then we should go up. And how we manage that, that's the hard part, but it should be a conversation that we should be having with everyone. And I keep an eye on local politics like most people do, especially when you're looking at housing, because that's where it always gets messy. And we're just not allowed to have those nuanced conversations anymore. It's either you have to pick a camp, and that's, you're not allowed to be. Well, I believe in density. I believe in density. I believe it should be in most of, in the appropriate parts of Sydney. But I believe it needs to be done well, and it needs to be the right type of housing for people. And that doesn't mean a 20-story tower of 2-bedroom apartments. That means, well, what's the demography of that area? What's the local market? What do people want from their area? Let's work together with the community to get that up. And we're definitely not having those conversations anymore.
You're not the first person who said that about that polarisation and how it was categorised in the Felinsky report. You're also around having to have a proper conversation, but there's so many vested interests. And, of course, when you're dealing at local council level, it's a different beast than, say, state government. And, recently there's been figures released showing how many of these local councils have been under-delivering in terms of their was it, I don't know the correct terminology, but the state government basically gives them a target, right, and says you need to create this many homes, and then they mostly under-deliver. But Wallara over-delivered, which was sort of interesting. That's very leafy. What is how? I mean, it's sort of, what is the answer? Obviously, there is very complex and, as you said, nuance. I think about Balmain. I often talk about Balmain, and it's just easy because there's so many different examples that Balmain can be a good, or stories where Balmain could be an example for. Back in 25, 30 years ago now, I think Unilever, it sort of got out of making toothpaste in Balmain, and that Meriton got hold of a massive big regeneration site. Now there's a talk about, leaked plans are in the Herald on the weekend about the whole White Bay area and what's the plans for that area. There are some very big sites still undeveloped in and around Sydney CBD. We're talking less than 3 k's from the CBD there on the harbour, It's just one example. But, over the years there's been many redevelopments in that area, but it's around the right sites coming up, and then of course the right sort of development in those sites, and then they've got to be sensitive to all the infrastructures you're talking about. There are so many hurdles that anybody's got to get over when they want to change a landscape in any of these areas. But what I get annoyed at, I don't know Mossman that well, to be honest, but I can't imagine there's too many old factories to be demolished over there. That's going to create opportunity to build apartments or townhouses. So therefore you're talking about individuals selling their houses to do that, right? And then you got rezoning. So there's all these other layers of who already owns the land, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess all this is the sort of stuff that goes through planners' minds.
Well, it does, right? But the economics of it, what's the great motivator of someone selling their land, or their house in Mossman? Well, it's probably because they're going to get a huge amount of money in return for it, right? And so, I think about Mossman as that great example of, I think their housing target is a couple of hundred a year or something. It's this tiny amount. They're not quite there. But when you actually go and walk around Military Road, at the sort of the beginning of Military Road, the closer to the city side of Military Road, they've actually built some really nice development facing the other way, sort of facing the back of Military Road, facing the opposite direction, and they've built some nice shops around there. Yeah. It's actually got to me, it looks like a really great example of how you could do a lot more along Military Road when the opportunity is there. Is let's flip the land, let's flip the orientation of the street to the back. Let's have some really well designed shop top housing. Let's put 4 or 5 stories of apartments above a nice layer of shops that are already there anyway, and let's create a little community that way, because I think it just looks good. It seems to be vibrant. I know the people that, when I've been there a few times and gone to the movies at the cinema there and had dinner close by, and it's like, this is quite nice here. I can see how this is working. So what's holding that back? I'm not sure. I think the answer to that is that people are just a bit scared of it. But when it's built, it seems, I don't think anyone would say it's a bad idea.
Well, I believe they haven't got the Woolworths shut down, or maybe it's got through now. But I mean, Mossman were able to overturn Woolworths, which you think would be a pretty easy one to get through, right? Local amenity, and even they were saying, no, it's a development we don't want. Let's get rid of that. So the NIMBYs are all the lawyers, and they're sort of band together, and they've got their little community groups to stop these things. I mean, is it really Greater Sydney's fault? Because they're saying, well, you can only build 300, and then they under-deliver on that through keeping their rates payers happy. So whereas in the Western Sydney, maybe the target's 8,000, right? So is it the problem where the government's not mandating and saying, right, we need to change, we need to have a bit more of a heavy hand here and say, right, there's a minimum rather than a target?
Well, I think there is issues there with the targets that were set in the plans. There is no mechanism to hold anyone to account. And I haven't seen in the Greater Sydney Commission, they released a little bit more detail about that, or what the Greater Cities Commission, the new body, and they're going, I think my understanding is they're going to have targets, but again, there's no talk yet of what happens if you do or don't do it. And there's plenty of ideas about how you do that. There's, the carrot and stick. There's incentives. If you do it, you get investment. You get more money for infrastructure. If you don't do it, we come in over the top and do it anyway. There's plenty of ideas out there, but I think fundamentally, though, I just don't believe that people have got to understand that. What I'd love to see is not a conversation about do or don't we need supply.
Yeah.
It's a conversation of what is the best type of supply. So let's just move. I know this is, in my utopian world where everyone is on board with me on this. It's a conversation. It's not a conversation about do we need 20 apartments or do we need 20 new dwellings. It's what are the best out of those 20, where's the best place for them, and how do we design it in a way that benefits everybody so the community doesn't suffer because of the density, we actually get more out of it. Beautiful example, right next to my house, I lived next to an old mixed-use lot that was totally underutilised, quite a big lot. Proposal went in about 8 years ago, for a 220 apartment block. And I mean, clearly the community just went absolutely bonkers over it, like absolutely bonkers. And I was like, look, I think it's actually quite I've got to practice what I preach here. This is a good idea, but let's actually get an outcome that we want from that development as opposed to not opposing the development. And so, I went through the process of a community member complaining about the development. I didn't complain about the development. I just offered my suggestions on how to make the development better. The retention of the trees around the area, some increase in privacy screenings for the local residents that are going to have apartments looking onto them. Just little design features that made it a better design as opposed to that. And I mean, the people that jumped up and down about it, if you ask them now about it 5 years after it's been built, they don't care. It's fine. It's part of the furniture. It's actually, if anything, it's improved the landscape of the street a little bit. It's it's not a dirty warehouse anymore. It's actually a really well maintained apartment block. The neighbours aren't scary. They're just like us. It's a perfectly good place, and everyone's happy with it. We've just got to get over this fear and try and embrace the change and manage the change that's better for everybody, because I think that is possible.
I think that's a good example, and certainly I get quite a few people come to me. It's like, oh my God, there's this big development next door, or we had it with the West Connex, which was pretty devastating for some people.
Yeah.
But the fear of what's the change is often greater than the actual outcome. And what I often say to people is that you already own that home, and yes, of course, you are staring down the barrel of major changes, which would be awful to be considering. However, if you try to sell it now and punt that onto the next buyer, their idea of the worst case scenario is going to impact your price. You're better off waiting and hoping it's not as bad as you expected, and then potentially having some input so that it isn't as bad. The worst case scenario doesn't happen. But I think too that, back to that sort of idea that the leafy suburbs aren't pulling their weight, and the less desirable suburbs, if you like, or those suburbs that are already got higher density are doing too much of their fair share. But it does come back to being pragmatic, doesn't it? I mean, like in Mosman, if you got a bunch of shop owners to sell and they rezoned and built 6-story apartments over and all the rest of it, there's still only a certain demographic that can afford to buy the apartments. It's still only going to have so many properties that are created, and it's not necessarily going to put a huge dent in the supply problem. And one of the actual things we did talk about in our commentary about the Felinski report, they had this sort of theory that, so someone lives in Mosman and something isn't built to their standards and they can't buy an apartment that suits their needs in the area that they want. They just won't move. They'll stay in their house. They're not going to go to the next suburb, which is not as desirable, and buy a lesser apartment with one less bedroom. That is not. There was this argument. There's no segmentation in the market. There's absolutely segmentation in the market, and so I just think that there's a bit of naivety. I think in some of the commentary around redeveloping Sydney or fitting more people into Sydney or Melbourne, for that matter. Mm-hmm. Would you agree?
Look, completely. And I get really frustrated. Like the answer is a nuanced answer. we want. I don't want any part of Sydney, the city that I live in, to be. I mean, there's a few examples of this, but to be so exclusive that only a tiny proportion of the people can actually live in that.
But we have places like that.
We've got places like that, but I don't. I mean, and then this is me thinking just from a personal point of view. I don't want us in the system that if we're designing a system going forward to just reinforce that and keep building on it until we get, create even more of a divide than we've already got. Like, I feel like we've got to try our absolute best to try and, get that balance of delivery of homes. And that also includes public and social housing. That, there's a strong argument on how important having that mix in society is forgetting about anything about returns on investment and all that, just from a functioning society. We're a better place, we're a better city if we have a good mix of people in terms of both the demography of a town. You don't want an aging suburb, which is what we've got in a lot of these northern parts of Sydney, where because they're so expensive, because the landowners are so kind of committed to that area, and because there's no opportunities for anyone else coming in 5 to 10, 15, 20 years time, you're going to have an enormous proportion of people, in that 65 plus, and no one in that younger demographic, that family demographic. And that's just going to that's not a great way to set up a suburb. It's just not. And that's by virtue of both land prices, property prices, but it's also a virtue of the fact that we're not delivering the right supply in those areas as well.
I mean, on that point, Chris, you said the right supply. That's where my brain goes to a little bit and say, well, we have been building stuff that hasn't been great. That's what David Chandler's talking about, right? But is there a point where the government should sort of step in and rezone and then put a mandate on the type of properties that are built, for example, and the real pressure cooker in Sydney is when you get to a family stage and you have a kid, it's easy for a single, it's easy for a couple, you can rent something, you can move. But when you get to this family stage, school zones come into the pressure, stability, security, etc. And we haven't got enough 3-bed apartments, and 2 beds only give them a certain runway. And then then the housing options or in greenfield estates will go regionally. And so do you think that there needs to be a mandate where, even though it's more profitable for development, which is a bit rich right now because developers are hardly making a profit with, what's happened in the last couple of years,
prices,
and their labour costs and their turnover and their stoppages and lockdowns, and it's tough going. But do you think that the government needs to come in there a bit more and say, right, look, we need to solve this long-term problem, because if we come back in 20 years' time, we're just going to build more studios, 1-beds and 2-beds, because it's better for the developer. It's not better for society. They can make more money that way. What's your thoughts on that argument?
It's really hard for me because I like the idea of the market dictating what it needs, but that means that there's a lot of noise that stops that from happening. So there is a need for both a bit of government intervention as well. When
you say that about the market dictating what it needs, I'm curious about that, because how does the market dictate all those 1 and 2 bedroom?
Yeah, and see, this is the problem, right? Yeah. I don't know if the market has got a true voice.
No, I don't think it does.
Saying I actually need a 3-bedroom.
Yeah.
I would like to live in a 3-bedroom small townhouse / apartment in the middle part of Sydney.
Yep.
That's new enough. That means, I don't have long-term problems with it. But I also need it close to transport to work. And so how many of those are on offer right now? And I think the answer to that is bugger all, right? I also look at my example as someone who bought a house in Sydney about 12 years ago. We bought a 2-bedroom terrace in Newtown. We still live in that terrace house because we're a family now. There's 4 of us. We actually ended up renovating that 2-bedroom and turning it into a bigger house because there wasn't the capacity for us to move into an appropriate house close by. Like we wanted to stay in the community, but we wanted a slightly bigger property. We just wanted an extra bedroom, basically, and for a number of reasons: availability, the difficulty it is in actually selling, the moving costs, the way that the system is set up. It made a lot more sense for us as a family to build and renovate as opposed to move. So what we've done is, in theory, and this is happening en masse, and I'd love to have a look at this in a bit more detail, is that stock of entry-level houses has been, there's been a renovation boom, right, over the last 5 or 6 years. I think when we get our new census coming out, something that I'd love to have a really good look at is that entry-level house story, but, how much of that has been kind of taken away and been renovated into a higher level. Like have we made it even harder on ourselves because we've got rid of a lot of entry level housing via a renovation boom? I think the answer is probably 100%.
And I'm in Newtown too, actually. But my office is in Balmain, and I hark back to 20 years ago when I started in real estate. There used to be 1-bedroom cottages you could buy. Yeah. And there's very, very few of those now because they've been turned into 2-bedroom cottages and so on with the twos turning to 3. Not all successfully or well done, but at the end of the day, they're bigger now and they can fit more people in them. And that's the gentrification story though as well. It
is, right? But we're not. It's either we've decided to change the stock.
And you're densified.
But have we actually maintained, like, where's the backup of that stock that I've decided to change? Like I personally have changed the stock to suit my needs, but what that's meant is that there's less entry-level housing. And if that happens en masse, then where's that top-up coming from? And the top-up 2-bedroom apartments? Well, maybe it is, but I don't know. Like I'm not convinced that and that's a fairly long-term view of the way that the stock in Sydney is evolving over time, and we need to keep an eye on that as well, as much as we need to keep an eye on what we're building right now. We need to know how we're changing what's already there.
It's so true. I mean, you've got less entry level for people first-time buyers, so they can't buy that 2-bed and renovate it because there's none of them come on the market because everyone's renovating them. They can't get the 3-bed or the 4-bed because they can't afford it. They've only got 2-bed apartments, and so their options for that are running out, right? And
I think
the issue we're finding with a lot of clients who are in that boat, because to upgrade is really difficult. The fundamentals, the logistics of doing it, the additional debt, stamp duty, selling costs, the risk of getting it wrong, so many things, right? It's not, and so the best option, let's just stay where we are. We like our neighbours, and we like our street. Let's just renovate. But I mean, the last year, has really scared a lot of clients off doing that because the building costs. We've got one who's got the quote was 1.1, now it's 1.7. It's same builder, same spec, but the builder's like, well, if I'm going to take it on, I want to protect myself. And people won't in Brisbane, you won't get fixed price contracts.
We've done 2 renos on our house, and we put a second level on a 2-story apartment. 2-story terrace, and the cost of that 7 years ago was the same as it cost us just recently to just renovate our kitchen.
Yeah,
when we saw the quote for the kitchen, we're like, oh, geez, I didn't realise the cost had gone up that much. It's like, wow. And I guess that's just a true reflection on how much extra it's now cost to, and that's a material cost, it's a labour cost, and everything, all of those, cost. We all know how much they've gone up. And you're right. Like, I mean, and you start getting to that over capitalization world where you're like, I'm pumping so much money into this house. Is that actually a smart move or not? I don't know. Yeah. Like there's some real sounds of it. Hopefully we've made a good decision, but
Also, I think one thing though, a couple of things around that. Obviously we got all these growing prices, and so that's usually referred to as median price growth. Every renovation actually inflates that median a little bit. You know what I mean? So when you're looking at growth rates in these gentrified areas, there's an element of renovation in that price growth. But there's also the fact that these renovations date whilst you made your house bigger. So that means, 20 years time it's going to be out of date again. And to be, you might sell again, you might sell then, you might sell before then, but the person that buys it with a 20-year-old renovation is effectively these days buying something to renovate again. Even though the envelope will be bigger. So there's a little bit of a rinse and repeat that happens in that way. But I do think that once you make the house bigger, that does obviously raise the bar. And also the shitty old, the old workers' cottages that had never had any work done on them, they still exist. I mean, I see enough of them, but obviously there's less and less of them. So, from a purchaser's point of view, finding something that was renovated in the 90s can often be a really good deal. They often sell for similar to the ones that have never been touched, but structurally they're better.
Yeah. So, Chris, we're running pretty light on time, but Dumbo of the week, have you got a story for us that we can learn from?
Well, the one thing that this is from a macro point of view, is that we've spoken about these new strategic changes that we've got at the moment in terms of the Greater Sydney Commissions. What we now have is about 3 or 4 layers of strategic planning that are all going to sit on top of each other, that are all referring to the same thing, and will potentially have competing actions, and sometimes just complete and utter. They'll just completely disagree on things. And what I'm interested to see, and I've seen this happen a lot when we do fundamental strategic planning changes, is we don't actually go back and have a look at what we've done in the past. And so we end up with these incredible contradictions where one says you can do it and one says you can't. And we're rapidly running into a time where we're going to have many of those, and your clients and our clients who are going to say, oh, can I do this on my property? You're going to end up with someone, or you're going to end up paying a planning consultant like myself a lot of money to tell him, oh, this one says yes, this one says no. And I see that happening a lot at the moment, and I'm fearful but optimistic maybe that they'll resolve those changes. But watch this space, because it's happening, and it's going to happen pretty quickly.
So this is the planning Dumbo. Does that mean that the lawyers get richer? Everything ends up in the Land Environment Court. Well,
inevitably, when you find these contradictions, someone's got to resolve it, and that's where you end up at court. And we've got too many people in our business who end up there resolving what I would have thought were pretty fundamental things that could have been fixed if someone had just put the right word into a change of legislation.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like you're a fan of a dictatorship here, Chris. So, but we won't go there.
Autocracy, get things done.
Let's just get things done, eh? Let's just use let's just be sensible and get things done. How about that?
Thanks so much for coming on, Chris. It's a really important chat, to be honest, because when you think about how cities are going to grow, and the complexities in doing it, and not just actually building it, and the zoning and materials, etc. There's so much to it. So people can just say we need more supply, but actually logistically, how do we do it? Is the big question. So thanks so much for coming on.
No, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for giving me the chance to have a chat with you both.
And cheers.
If you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or North Shore, my team and I can help you buy without regrets. Reach out via my website, gooddeeds.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading into a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, my team love to carefully guide you on this journey. And most importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to see you again.
And remember, don't be a dumbo.